Hi, everyone. This week, we want to get into increasing your understanding of what's expected in your agency policy analysis. I've included in this series of PowerPoints both the framework for policy analysis, proposal writing, and presentation, along with some detailed information about what is expected in each one of those arenas. So let's move through the PowerPoints and I'll see if I can give you a better idea of what I'm expecting you to do in terms of analyzing a particular agency policy. The first step in the process, as you can see from the PowerPoint, is to familiarize yourself with a specific issue or problem. Policy analysis begins with really considering what the specific social welfare issue or problem is. And here I want to emphasize that you should be analyzing a particular social welfare policy or problem that exists within your agency. So in general, that means that personnel policies, unless they affect the social welfare of your clients, probably aren't going to be appropriate for analysis. If they do affect the social welfare of your clients, then of course that would be appropriate. The issue may have to do with victimization or perhaps defects in policy implementation. We've had examples in the past of people, for example, analyzing agency policies at agencies where they work that didn't seem fair to their clients in terms of if they were youth in a residential facility, for example, the amount of phone time they had or the type of uniform they had to wear or something like that. So as long as you make sure it's a social welfare issue or problem, then of course it would be appropriate for analysis. If you have questions on this, please send me a message within the course site and I'll try to give you some guidance. When you are deciding what specific issue or problem to address with your analysis, you might ask yourself what political, social, or cultural factors led to the creation of the issue. And here I want you to consider our discussion from last week about the important roles that values and beliefs play in underlying policy. As I mentioned last week, policies exist for a reason. People didn't just dream them up out of the blue. And frequently, the beliefs and values and also the ethics of the policy are clear if you can get some context for how the policy was developed and implemented. Your best source for this might be your supervisor or someone who worked at the agency when the policy was implemented. Sometimes there's such turnover in agencies, you may not be able to access this information, and you may have to make an educated guess about the cultural, social, and political factors, as well as the values and beliefs that were driving the development of implementation policy maybe a decade ago or so. There are also several remedies or solutions that you're asked to provide, and you'll see in the next slide that we're talking about brainstorming any array of options that you might implement. You should consider at least three. And then your analysis leads you ultimately to conclude that one of the options is better than the other two. In rejecting the other two, you might ask yourself, why are the other two insufficient to address the issue? Or why is mine better? And that will be part of the analysis. You're also going to be asked to look briefly at the budgetary considerations for implementing your particular policy recommendation or modification. You do not have to have a detailed budget attached to this particular policy analysis, but I do want you to make an educated guess about what it would cost to implement your policy compared to leaving the policy as it is. Then you'll have to come up with some suggestion about where the funds would come from to implement your policy and whether or not they would be sufficient. As a part of your analysis, make sure that you also analyze early on what adverse consequences the current problem or issue poses for vulnerable populations such as your clients. Do those adverse consequences suggest urgent action is required, or is it something that can be discussed, developed, and implemented over time? Okay, so let's look at how you brainstorm your options for policy development. In figuring out what you want to do to address the current issue or problem with the current policy, always be sure to consider policy, programmatic, and/or resource options when you're developing your alternatives. As I suggested, I like you to develop 3 alternatives and discuss those as they relate to the criteria that are listed in the next slide. So you'll have 3 options. You'll go through the criteria for each one of the 3 options, and going through the criteria is what leads you to discover what your best option is. And I'll give you an example of that in slide 4. You can look at the policy alternatives by mixing policy programs and/or resources, and you should look at all 3, and it might be all 3 that you would use individually to make your decision. But you might just use one of these that as an override to all of the other decisions. So for example, you might have the best policy in the world, but if it costs $1 million in your school district, it's not going to get implemented. So there, you're considering the policy, the programmatic, and the resources options, but you reject 2 of them based simply on the fact that you don't have the resources to implement maybe the 2 most desired policies. And so you're going to go with the 3rd policy alternative simply because it's affordable and doable. And then you might also, in brainstorming your options, define a strategy for addressing the issue or problem. So you have to describe in the course of developing your policy alternative, the one you end up choosing, why is this the best strategy looking at policy programs and/or resources? Why is this the best policy for addressing the issue or the problem at this particular time? Here's how you analyze the relative merits of each of the competing options you're going to develop for your agency policy. These 5 criteria appear on the grading rubric, which you can find attached to the assignment. So you want some of the criteria, and you must address these 5. If you have others you want to address, that's fine, but a minimum, you have to address these 5 criteria. So the first one is value-based criteria, such as social justice, ethics, fairness, self-determination, the dignity and worth of a person, those kinds of values that are common to social work. You must weigh those values for all 3 of your options against the policy that's currently there. Then I want you to examine how effective each of the policies would be. And again, here, all 3 of your alternatives may be equally effective, but because of resource considerations, you have to reject 2 of them in favor of a 3rd one. Be sure to do a cost-benefit analysis, a brief one, for each of the alternatives you develop. Discuss any practical political considerations, such as, you want to fund a politically controversial policy change, and the board at the school, the board members happen to be exceptionally conservative or something like that, in which case, in considering that as a political consideration, you may decide to go with a different alternative altogether. And then also consider the ease of implementation for each of your options. By going through these 5 criteria, you should be able to, what I call, sift out what the best overall policy option is compared to the one that currently exists. Then your job is to draft a specific policy that you can present to the class and to the key stakeholders. You, of course, can propose a brand new policy where maybe one doesn't exist at all, or you can propose a modification to any current policy that happens to exist that you think could be improved. And oftentimes when you draft your proposal, it can include a proposed budget. Now you have a limited amount of time to do your policy proposal presentations. I think I've allocated 20 to 30 minutes for those. So be mindful that you don't want to have a 30-page proposal. I did not set a page length for the requirement for your current policy that you're going to be proposing, but I do want you to give it consideration, full consideration, addressing each of the criteria that we looked at, each of those 5 criteria we looked at in the previous 5 slides. I want you to detail in your paper how you have involved others from the beginning of your consideration for what to do. What supervisor did you talk to? Did you talk to any constituents? Did you talk to any people who are clearly affected by a policy change? Who did you get feedback from who will help you decide what the best alternative is to either modify a current policy or to implement a new policy? So that should also be discussed in your paper. Then, of course, once you've finished the policy, and if you can create an actual policy itself, that is, write it up and draft it, that's fine. Sometimes working your way through that process, some policies are so complex that it's almost impossible. In your case, I do expect you to make an effort to draft either a policy modification, that is, you provide us as an attachment with the assignment, you will provide us with a copy of your handout, the policy itself, and then where you've made the modifications. Okay, so you might have a 6-page policy at work. Make sure that you bring that original policy and then a copy of the modifications that you're intending to propose to that policy. You do not have to rewrite all 6 pages of the policy, if that makes sense. And again, if you need clarification, please send me a message within the course site. Your presentation to both the class and to the key stakeholders at your agency are going to be designed to persuade them that your policy has merit and that it should be enacted. And then, of course, the idea is before you present to your agency, you will incorporate class feedback into your presentation so that when you make your presentation to your key decision makers, you have all the possible feedback you need to really make a powerful presentation to them to persuade them that, in fact, it has merit. All right, if you have questions or comments, please send me a message. Try to avoid sending me emails because I get so many emails in a day. I would have to sift through all of those, and it is very likely that your work can get lost. So if you have a question, send it as a public message within the course website, and that will help me answer the question once for other people who might also have that question. Thank you very much. Have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you in class on February 12th. Bye.